Hey guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we have quite an interesting topic to talk about. We're gonna discuss about orchid responses which are actually natural being mistaken for problems or ailments and actually taking some actions which at the end of the day are unnecessary and quite dangerous. I'm gonna show you some examples and talk a little bit about them. All of these examples have been actually inspired by the comment section. All of these things have been said at some point or another, so I think it's important to talk about them. If you know my channel, you know that I'm a rather statistical person. I like to see the context, the percentages, the statistics. I find that it always helps me have a bigger picture, a bigger understanding of stuff rather than taking isolated things and treating them as they are. I like to put them in the grand scheme of things. But there is such a thing as false statistic, drawing the wrong conclusion. We call that a fallacy. And one that really applies to today's video, and one of my favorites, is the one that goes something like correlation doesn't imply causation. In translation, if something is related to something else, it doesn't mean that that something caused the other thing. And in all of today's cases, you will see how good that applies. Alrighty, let's start with something very recent, repotting orchids. Now, one of the problems people express regarding repotting is, I repotted my orchid and then it lost all of its roots or it died. Therefore, I shall never repot an orchid again. Now, repotting is one of the most important aspects of orchid growing. At one point or another, we all repot orchids, whether it's due to medium getting old or the orchid not fitting in the pot anymore or just a setup change. We all repot orchids. There are also articles talking about this. There's also a website called Repot Me, which deals with things to repot your orchids in. So repotting is something everybody does, and the vast majority of us don't seem to have any issue with repotting. So which is more plausible? Repotting is overall bad and you should never do it, or you did it wrong, or the orchid already had an issue prior to you repotting it. I think the latter is more logical, don't you think? Now, there is such a thing as transplant shock, or orchids responding bad to a repotting. I'll link you down below to the videos that I made regarding them, and as you will see, the repotting itself is not necessarily the cause of the decline, but the way it was made, the way it was handled. In those videos, I do talk about some ways to minimize transplant shock, and in many cases, you can actually avoid transplant shock. But in some cases, inevitably, you will have some issues after repotting. Whether you destroyed a little bit too many roots and the orchid will be set back, or the orchid already had some root issues that were just invisible when you repotted, and decline is actually a natural response. As we've seen in yesterday's video, my orchid looked very dehydrated, it had limpy leaves, and this is because it actually lost all of its roots. Did I damage the roots in the repotting? No, I didn't, but as we've seen in the original video, this orchid, and not only the other one as well, had really big issues with the root system, and I did leave on quite a few more roots than maybe I should have, in the hopes that they were not as sick as I thought. Well, they were, and in the end, all of those roots died off. It doesn't mean the medium was bad or my technique was bad or anything of the sorts. It just means that in that particular instant, the orchid was hiding some underlying problems, and the limpiness and dehydration was a natural response to lack of roots. The orchid could not hydrate herself. But the cause of the problem was not the repotting. If you've watched the original video, you saw that it already had some issues, and the flowers were dropping, the buds were blasting. I was also telling you that it has been quite cold in the flower shops. People were watering orchids more than they should under these conditions. So there are some underlying problems. I think it's easy to see why drawing the conclusion that repotting is bad for orchids is actually a very dangerous conclusion. Orchids do need repotting at some point or another due to various reasons, if you're using pots and especially organic media and so on and so forth. So never repotting an orchid might ease your peace of mind, but might actually be very detrimental in the long run for the orchid. Just think about the orchid, how it looked like, what you did. Maybe there is something you can actually correct and prevent for the future. Because the truth of the matter is, we all repot orchids. We should all have dead orchids after repotting, but we don't. And this is how you put things into context. And doing that will be the first step to actually solve an issue. Next issue is regarding flower spikes, Phalaenopsis but other orchids as well. Some people have stated that they cut the flower spike of the orchid and the orchid never rebloomed again. Therefore, they shall never ever in their life cut a flower spike again. Which, just like in the first example, needs to be put into some sort of context. Now, regarding the cutting of the flower spike, if you're a beginner, you're watching this video and you don't know exactly what we mean by cutting the flower spike, I'll link you down below to my video. There are multiple ways in which you can cut it, multiple lengths. Just to give you some idea about what I prefer, I usually cut the flower spike all the way down. I'm not interested in branches, keikis, or anything of the sorts. I like to give orchids a clean vegetative growth, and then I like to see fresh new flower spikes developing each autumn. Now, Phalaenopsis can stay in bloom for a lot of time. They can also produce secondary branches, extending the blooming time, but they produce new flower spikes each autumn or winter because they actually have a sort of environmental trick that triggers them into spiking. I have a video about it, of course. Check it down below if you're a beginner. If you don't know these stuff, most of my viewers already know them. But if you've never had a flower spike again from a Phalaenopsis, but everybody else kind of does, then maybe it's not a problem of orchids never spike again if you cut the flower spike. Maybe it's a problem of not actually offering that little environmental trick, which if you watch the video, you'll see it's actually really easy. It has to do with a drop in temperature. If the orchid has grown during the warmer months, is in perfect condition, and it does receive adequate environmental conditions, there is no reason for it not to rebloom. Except if you don't provide the drop in temperature, which is something some of my viewers do have issues with, but they do live in rather warm climates. It really depends on the actual individual, on the hybrid itself. Some orchids don't need as low temperatures as others, while other hybrids can prove to be rather tricky. So there is a degree of variability here, but if you watch the video, you see the segment of temperatures that I find covers most of these hybrids. So before you draw the conclusion that you should never ever cut flower spikes again, which you can obviously do, just make sure that you didn't do anything wrong. Because there are very remote cases in which cutting a flower spike is actually beneficial for the orchid, like we've seen in yesterday's video. So maybe you leaving the flower spike can lead to an orchid's demise. Very rare cases, but it can happen and you never know when it's gonna happen. So knowing exactly why things happen will help you in the future. Even though you might not benefit from it now, you never know what the future holds. Next problem is regarding sphagnum moss, and this is an old one. I knew about it even before I started making YouTube videos. Some people suggest that sphagnum moss is the worst thing ever created on the face of Earth for orchids. It kills orchids, it should never be used, and some viewers have even gone as far as to criticize me. How can I actually recommend it? And well, I agree that sphagnum moss does have a learning curve. Again, you'll have a video down below in the description. You'll have tons of videos about the things we're talking about. And in that video, I actually talk more about how to properly use sphagnum moss. Because unlike all the other organic media, moss has a really great trait. It retains a lot of water and is very wicking. Now, retaining a lot of water can be good for a lot of people, such as myself, but kind of bad for some people who really don't need that much water retention. So just like any other media, sphagnum moss is more suited in certain climates or environments, in certain pots for certain orchids. There is no one medium to rule them all, because we all live in different environments and we all have different lifestyle, capabilities, availability to water and to care for our orchids. Now, I can see why moss can be quite scary for many people. How many of us ordered orchids which were just packed so tight in sphagnum moss, and when we unpotted them, we found a lot of suffocated roots? I think most of us have gone through that experience. And well, that's an improper way of using moss on the long term. On the short term, it kind of works. It takes a little bit of time for the orchid roots to suffocate. Usually, progress is very gradual when it comes to orchids. At some point or another, if moss is not used properly, it can definitely cause issues. But so do other media. Moss is just one of those unique media which has some unique features which, if used improperly, can cause damage, of course. But when used properly, It's just so helpful, and it was a learning curve for me as well, but now I can grow orchids so much better because of moss. There are orchids which do prefer this medium a lot more than any other media in my climate, and because they're happy, obviously I'm more relieved and I don't need to put in so much work either because moss is giving me a helping hand. So in the end, it's absolutely fine if you don't want to use moss or if it doesn't really work all that well in your climate, but at some point you might actually discover that you need something more water retentive, maybe for a mount, maybe for a little basket, who knows. Case in which, if you're gonna completely disregard moss, you will maybe have a harder time with other media which are not so water retentive or don't have the properties of moss. Not to mention, if you go around telling people that moss is not good, you might actually do more damage than good to them. Because if moss was indeed the worst medium out there, why would anybody use it and use it successfully? Orchids responding bad to moss is a natural response to something that is suffocating them, or that is staying too wet or too cold or too compact for their liking. But the very same orchids can actually have a much better response to moss if it's actually used better, if it's used with a lighter hand, more airy, in smaller pots, in baskets, in other setups, let's say. The same orchid which gave you issues in moss can thrive in moss if used in a different way. And you could actually have a much easier life when it comes to maintenance as watering as well. But it is indeed a learning curve. Now let's go back a little bit to yesterday's video. Some people saw the yellowing leaves here and thought, oh my goodness, stem rot. Now, if you know my channel, you know that I did have quite a few experiences with stem rot. I know how it looks like, how fast it acts, and I do believe I am pretty good at recognizing it. This doesn't mean that I am always 100% right, but it also doesn't mean that I need to act on impulse. So as you can see, my very dehydrated orchid here has some yellowing leaves. Most probably these leaves will fall. One thing you will notice with the more dehydrated or stressed orchids you will have is that they will tend to lose older structures. When it comes to monopodials, it will be the older leaves. When it comes to sympodials, it will be the older leaves on the older pseudobulbs or the old pseudobulb altogether. When the orchid is stressed and dehydrated, it does have a tendency to discard older structures just to conserve energy. This is what I believe is going on with this orchid as well. There is nothing to suggest that stem rot is definitely my case here. Stem rot acts fast. Within a week, you can have a pretty dead orchid. A week, 2 weeks maybe. This orchid has been around for a month, more than a month. And whatever happened, happened very gradually. Also, the orchid does not have a lot of roots, hence the dehydration and stress. When you're dealing with stem rot, the root can be in tip-top condition, can even still be growing, while the axis will completely go away. It's pretty sad. It's a sad situation to see. So in this case, we do have some other reasons to believe that the orchid might just be stressed and discarding older structures. Also, I did not put water in the crown or in between the leaves or anything of the sorts. I didn't spray the orchid. And overall, just looking at the big picture, there isn't anything to suggest that 100% I have stem rot here. Whatever I see here looks like a normal response to stress to me so far. Now, why would drawing the wrong conclusion can lead to more bad things? Well, the discussion yesterday in my comment section went from stem rot to let's cut the axis a little bit and see if it's green or brown. And that is something, my friends, we do not do. We don't cut monopodial stems unless we have serious reason to believe we need to. There are instances where indeed cutting of the stem is beneficial, but stem rot is not necessarily one of them if we don't know the entry point. And that's the main problem of stem rot. Where is the infection? Here, lower? Where is it? We don't know. Also, this particular Phalaenopsis, like most Phalaenopsis, doesn't have a long stem. It is a pretty young, pretty new orchid. If I cut just a little bit of it, I can actually cut crucial structures that would otherwise produce roots and leaves or keikis. Also, by cutting the stem, we are producing an open wound. And this is not a sympodial. We're not cutting into a rhizome. We are not eliminating just one pseudobulb and the orchid has 10. We are eliminating part of its main or core growth structure. Putting an open wound in this structure will definitely increase the risk of stem rot. If you didn't have stem rot thus far, now you're in serious trouble. You might actually cause stem rot. So this is a little bit extreme, but it does happen. This is what drawing a wrong conclusion can do and acting way too fast. The worst thing to do is acting when you're not sure, when you would still have time to think about it, but you didn't take that time. Some things happen fast, and sometimes you need to act fast and you have nothing to lose. But in this instance, I have everything to lose because of all of the context of the orchid. Bottom line, falling or yellowing leaves doesn't always mean stem rot. This is, in my opinion, thus far, natural response to stress. Orchids naturally lose structures when they're stressed, and not only, indeed, this is premature, but I don't believe it's stem rot, therefore, I don't think there's any need to cut any stem. And the last problem we're going to talk about today is leaf pigmentation. There are orchids which naturally have freckles or a red or purple tinge on their leaves, or even paler leaves, like the case of the summer blooming Phalaenopsis. And from time to time, I do get those comments saying, oh my goodness, my orchid has purple spots, it's an infection, what can I use on it? Or, oh, you have this tinge on your orchid, you need to feed with this and that, and so on and so forth. That's very common in recent years, and again, without knowing the actual context and the history of things, this is a very, very wrong conclusion to draw. Now, some orchids under bright light can develop anthocyanin spots, and it's absolutely natural. Some Vanda orchids and Cattleya orchids do display these very dark purple dots. It doesn't mean this is an infection, and it certainly does not mean the orchid is sick in any way. It is actually natural pigmentation. Likewise, there are species which are known to have a lot of anthocyanin pigments, so their hybrids can actually inherit this trait. I have here an Ascocentrum miniatum hybrid, which naturally has red pigmentation, which has been transferred to this hybrid as well. Here I have an Ascanopsis, which again is rather red because of the Ascocentrum in its parentage. And here we have a proper Ascocentrum orchid. I think you can see the pigmentation we have on the leaves. Not knowing about the trait of the actual species can lead you to believe that there's something wrong with the orchid, particularly when your orchid sits next to a perfectly green one. But that's the thing, this orchid is not supposed to be red, while this one is, particularly under bright light. Bright light always makes anthocyanin pigments show more. Thus, this coloration is a natural response of the orchid to light. Some orchids don't respond like this. In intense light, some orchids actually become pale. So again, we need to think about the context here. If you know you have not fertilized your orchid at all, ever, then yes, there's a high chance you're suffering from a deficiency. But if you know your orchid is sitting in super bright light, and it does have a tendency to have purple tinges, and you also know that you're fertilizing with a complete menu, then why would you believe that your orchid is deficient? Put it in the context and then think about it. Don't separate it from the context, because you will draw the wrong conclusion. So on that bombshell, I think it's time to end. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Hope you've enjoyed it. You know the drill. Like or dislike this video below. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, Q&As, and other fun orchid subjects. And if you like YouTube to notify you whenever I upload a new video, just turn on notifications for my channel. Also, if you're curious about my setups and things that I use, just visit the description. I have everything there. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!